Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to this week's Schiller Institute International webcast featuring Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute and also the president of the Schiller Institute. This has been another week of very significant developments that we are out in front of and that we have to discuss today to get our audience out in front of these issues also. But strategic developments including the evidence, continuing evidence of the corrupt and immoral practices of the special counsel Robert Mueller. There are now congressmen calling for shutting down the investigation and even putting some of these people in jail. And this is occurring just as we are expanding our distribution of the Mueller dossier. But it's also a moment of very grave danger. That there's a good reason why there are often wars and terrorist events and false flags that occur at the end of the summer and during the Christmas season, namely because people aren't paying attention. So we have to make sure that people are paying attention as we enter this crucial period at the end of 2017. Now, I'd like to begin with the National Security Strategic Doctrine that was just released by the president and the administration. Helga, you've pointed to the differences between what Trump has said and also the language of the doctrine, that there are some differences, but one of the key problems is that you identified that this is part of the old geopolitics. So I'd like you to discuss what you mean by that and why that's a significant problem.
Well, I think the paper was written by a certain woman called Nadia Shedlov, who is close to, or said to be close to, McMaster's, and she already was working in the vicinity of Bush and Cheney. She comes from an army background. I mean, this document is clearly looking at the world, from the standpoint of, as you said, geopolitics. And if you look at it from that standpoint, naturally, then China and Russia, but especially China, which is rising, are regarded as rivals or enemies. And I think that this paper, Trump, which is very unusual, insisted that he presents the paper and not the National Security Advisor, who normally is presenting such a report. And obviously, it seems that he did that in order to soften certain formulations. For example, apart from going through some of the language of the report, he also said that he wants to build a very strong partnership with Russia and China. And for example, this had the ridiculous effect that some European newspapers would say, oh, he can't even read the paper because he said things which are different than in the report. And I think it reflects the fact that the faction fight in the Trump administration is far from being over, that there is still the effort by the neocons and by leftovers of previous administrations in various aspects of this administration, which express themselves in this report. And Trump, who after all had a very successful state visit to China a little while ago and who has talked successfully on the telephone with Putin in the last week, defeating a terrorist attack which was planned for St. Petersburg and similar very productive things. So I think Trump still has the inclination that he wants to work with Russia and China. But I think if you look at the very sharp, extremely sharp reactions coming from the Russian Foreign Ministry, from Peskov, the spokesman of the Kremlin, from Global Times, from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, from the Chinese embassy in Washington, they all basically say this doctrine reflects an outmoded kind of thinking. They point to the fact that there is a completely new era shaping especially the West Pacific, because in this paper there are 6 regions, one of them being the Western or Eastern Pacific, and obviously this is one of the areas which are completely changed through the Belt and Road Initiative, where all the countries of the region are cooperating with China in a win-win cooperation to the mutual benefit of each of them. And, that therefore, and since the offer was made many times to the United States and to Europe to cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative, there is actually no reason to go into such an adversarial position. Now, I think the Russians basically called it an imperial document, insist that it reflects the desire to still insist on an unipolar world, which is long gone, so it's a completely futile effort. And the Chinese also were extremely, basically critical in saying this is an outmoded way of thinking and cannot lead to anything positive. So, but it shows you that the world is very far from being out of danger zones. And, I mean, I'm normally, giving credit to Trump because, unlike his predecessors, Bush and Obama, I mean, he has stretched out his hand to Russia and China, and, he still has the potential to, move the world into a different direction. So, but nevertheless, when he does something which I'm not so happy about, I also take the liberty to say that. It is interesting that of all places, the Wall Street Journal had an article yesterday by a certain individual called Arthur Herman, who is still within geopolitics, but he says the fact that you have three men, Trump, Xi Jinping, and Putin, who are basically all working what he calls a balance of power, which I don't think is the right expression, but he says, therefore, we have left behind us the Wilsonian age of permanent wars, which led the world to almost continuous wars in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria, and so forth. And he says this age is now over because of these three men. Now, I think there is a completely different quality to that relationship and the potential of that relationship, namely what Xi Jinping calls the community for a shared future of mankind, and what we normally call, that humanity united for the common aims of mankind. That is the potential. But I think, we are in one of these areas, and I think one of the commentaries in, I think, one Chinese paper said that there are many different conceptions how the future of mankind should be shaped, and that is not yet a settled question. And I think that that is absolutely true, but that is why it is so absolutely important to overcome this geopolitical view, which has the idea that you have groups of countries or one country which has a legitimate interest against the others. I mean, that is the kind of thinking which led to 2 world wars in the 20th century. And I think it should be obvious to anybody that in the age of thermonuclear weapons, that thinking can only lead to the possible annihilation of the human species. So we should get rid of it.
I've received several emails from viewers who have said they agree with a lot of what we say, but they don't understand why you're so focused on this question of geopolitics, because they say, isn't geopolitics the natural order of international relations? And you basically answer that question, but is there anything else you'd like to say on that? Because I think this is a crucial issue coming up as it does around this national strategic document.
Well, I think the only way to look at it is from the long arc of the evolution of the human species. I mean, in the beginning, when you had still tribal formations and, little ethnic groupings, people would have various ways of settling conflicts, either diplomacy or negotiation. And if that didn't work, armed conflict and war. And, that obviously was a characteristic of human development for a very long time. But I think that that is not the true nature of mankind, because if you continue the idea that if all negotiations and diplomacy fail, you still can resort to war in the age of thermonuclear weapons. this would be the end of civilization. And I see this idea of using war as a means of conflict resolution, that corresponds to the age of maybe 4-year-old little boys who think it's okay to kick the other one on the knee and vice versa. And I think humanity has the potential of becoming adult, that you can indeed, through negotiation and especially through the establishment of a higher order of collaboration in the interest of everybody, that you can establish a way for the human governance worldwide, where war is no longer a method of solving conflict. And I admit this thinking comes very much from the great thinker of the 15th century, Nicolas of Cues, who is the father of modern science, who is also the father of the idea of the sovereign nation state. And he developed a method of thinking which he called the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites, where he said that because man is capable of creative reason, that you can think a higher order where conflicts on the lower order disappear. The argument that the one has a higher power than the many. And that thinking, I think, has gone into the Peace of Westphalia, the idea that you can overcome conflict by establishing a common interest. And I think that thinking, even if I don't think Nicolas of Cues is very known in China, but I still think that probably because of the Confucian tradition, the idea of the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative of Xi Jinping, reflects exactly that philosophical approach. So I think that if mankind becomes adult, we will not waste energy anymore on stupid things like money chasing, stock market speculation, and other things which are really a waste of time, but that we will become adult and that people will become creative and relate to the creativity of the other, and that not only between people but also between nations. So I think that is the right way to look at things, and not from the standpoint of eternal Aristotelian conflict between A and B, one geopolitical group against another one, but that the Kozhanische view of the coincidence of opposites, the one humanity first, is the better way to look at it.
Well, I've had some experience recently with resolving conflicts between 3- and 4-year-olds. I can assure you that adult supervision is absolutely necessary. And that's what you've been talking about in terms of the CUSA approach. But we saw something completely crazy in the last days from Newsweek magazine, from Bild Zeitung, again, bringing up the specter of a Russian army overrunning Europe. What's wrong with these people?
Well, it is very clear that the Russian maneuver, the Zapad 2017, which the Newsweek article and also the Bild Zeitung referred to, was a demonstration on the side of Russia that they are intending to defend their country. And it is a reaction to the whole NATO policy of encirclement, of moving more and more troops to the Russian border. But the idea that Russia would, in a conventional way, occupy the 3 Baltic states, bomb Poland with Iskander missiles from Kaliningrad, bomb infrastructure in Germany, Sweden, and Finland, that's just completely absurd. This will never happen. And I think it's just a scare story to, among other things, to create a motivation for a conventional build-up. And it naturally came in the context also, these articles, of the decision of the European Council to create a European Defense Union, which is a completely ridiculous idea. This will not make the EU more integrated. To the contrary, it will cause more opposition. And I just think it's a expression of those people who absolutely oppose the new paradigm, who want to use geopolitics. It's the old British manipulation, divide and conquer, play the weaker one against the stronger one and vice versa, and that way keep control. So it's really a tool of the oligarchy and imperialism to keep, the old order, but I don't think it has any chance of success.
And speaking of the old order, we see the continuation of the Mueller investigation, but we now are seeing something different emerge. You had the scandals around McCabe, the deputy director of the FBI, Strzok and his mistress writing text messages to each other about the necessity to prevent Trump from becoming president or to have an insurance policy if he becomes president. You have Bruce Orr and his wife, who were part of the Fusion GPS crowd. Now, this led to comments from Trey Gowdy, the head of the Oversight Committee of the House. He said it demonstrates unprecedented bias. Jordan, the congressman from Ohio, Republican congressman, said everything points to the fact that there was an orchestrated plan to try to prevent Donald Trump from becoming the president of the United States. Grassley is calling for firing some of these people. What's it going to take to shut down the Mueller investigation, given all these exposés coming out right now?
Well, there are rumors circulating that Trump may come out with a Christmas surprise. Now, if that would happen, it would be an interesting thing, and it obviously would be, somebody to investigate this whole complex in the form of a special investigator. But I think also already now these congressmen and senators you mentioned, Nunes, Grassley from the Senate, Gowdy and Getz and various others, I think they are quite fired up already about what they are finding. And even the media are not entirely covering it up anymore. There was a quite good article in Denmark in the conservative daily newspaper Berlingske Tidende, which said, Obama bureaucrats conspired to prevent the election from Trump, and after that failed, they are trying to topple him, and then they go through the whole story of, who are the culprits. So it is coming out. Even the FAZ could not avoid reporting it, even though typical way they try to downplay it and say, oh, all these people who say deep state, these are conspiracy theories and so forth. But the truth is coming out. Now, we in the United States, that is our colleagues from LaRouchePAC, they did a full mobilization with a lot of activists. They distributed the dossier about Mueller in all congressional offices, in all the Senate offices. And they had, as they were telling, many in-depth discussions, where the interest about what is happening has been increasingly there, because it seems that some people in the Congress realize that what's at stake is the Constitution of the United States. The Congress has oversight rights against the intelligence agencies, and if these agencies are loyal to a previous administration who was involved in such incredible schemes, they are aware of the fact that if they don't act right now, then you can throw the Constitution of the United States in the waste paper basket. But I think it will require a continuous effort and mobilization, because these people are quite desperate, because they see that their whole system is coming down. And if this investigation continues, I mean, there were several people who said what was done by the Department of Justice or some people in it and the FBI were felonies. And, so they are trying to, twist the situation to avoid the consequences of their doing. But I think it's reaching a very, very serious point where the tide is turning already, but it is a fight. So stay tuned with us and don't be complacent. Don't eat too many cookies over Christmas. Stay tuned and stay mobilized.
And I think also it's important that we provide a certain kind of leadership that's essential which is to identify not just the connectos and the names and the corruption, but what was the intent? And this again gets to the thing we were talking about at the beginning, the attempt to stop President Trump from having a strategic cooperation alliance with Russia and China. You had Clapper, who was the former deputy or the director of national intelligence, sticking his foot in his mouth once again, saying Putin knows how to handle an asset. And that's what he's doing with the president. So I think it's crucial that we get people to understand that this is not just about Trump's character or people not liking Trump, but it has to do with this whole shift into a new paradigm. Now, on that, you talked a little bit before about the situation in Europe. There's a whole series of crises brewing in terms of East Europe, the banking situation, a statement from a prominent Italian economist that the euro is fascist. What's going on? What's the latest on the situation in Europe?
Well, this Italian economist is very critical of the euro for similar reasons why we have been critical, or for example, the former Professor Hanke, who had laid out the argument quite well that the Eurozone was never an optimal currency zone because you had countries which had a rural character, you had industrialized countries, and Europe is not a country, there is no European people. It's not like the United States, or it's not even like Latin America, because you have almost 30 nations, cultures, traditions. People in one country, in Slovenia, know absolutely nothing about people in Elsass-Lothringen, or people in. There is just no way how you can even know, because you're not reading their newspapers, even if the newspapers don't report that much themselves. So there is no European people. And what this Professor Banyai said is that while the supporters of the euro are not wearing black shirts, however, anybody who plans to implement his goal through violence is representing a form of fascism. And what he refers to is that everybody knows the euro does not function. He said it's written in all the textbooks that it's a question of time until this euro construction will collapse. And then that crisis is intended to lead to a further European integration. And he says that is fascism. Now, that is not so far-fetched as some people may think, because, for example, Jacques Attali, who was the key advisor and eminence grise of France in the time of Mitterrand, he said many times that the fathers of the euro created it deliberately with the worst defect, so that it would come to a crisis, and that crisis could then be used to implement the political union, which you cannot get through otherwise. I mean, there is very clearly a big opposition against the idea of a United States of Europe, for the reasons I earlier said, that there is no European people. So there are these calls right now. Macron, Juncker, Martin Schulz, they all have given only slightly different versions of an idea that now, because of all of these crises, the refugees, the tensions among the different East and West European countries, that one should impose a United States of Europe. Now, I think this has as much chances as a snowflake in hell, because all these efforts now to impose a supranational construct which eliminates even more sovereignty will cause more opposition and more reaction. So I think it will not work. And I find it quite significant that several advisors of the Hungarian Prime Minister Orban were saying that this discussion about the United States of Europe reminds them of Hitler. So the tone has become quite sharp, and I think it's very much away from unity. And the latest atrocity, so to speak, is the fact that the European Union decided to apply Article 7 on Poland, taking their voting rights away. Now, first of all, this also will not function because this could only be implemented if there would be unity among the other 26 states. But Hungary already said they will not back the decision of the EU against Poland. And they're now talking about similar measures against Romania. I think all of this will lead just to more controversy and more disunity. And if they keep doing this, Poland may even leave the EU because they under no circumstances will back down.
And just quickly on the crisis in Europe, anything on the non-government situation in Germany?
Oh, that is a terrible situation because, you know, I mean, it's now almost 3 months after the election. And first, the so-called Jamaica coalition talks failed. Now they are talking about a grand coalition. Merkel says only that she will accept as an outcome, while the SPD says no, they want to have an open-ended discussion, maybe support of a minority government, which Merkel has ruled out. All of this is going on and on and on. And I think the biggest problem with this is that none of the participating parties has any vision what should be the future of Germany, where should Europe be in 10 or 100 years from now. So it's all about power politics, it's about position, it's about little issues. And, you know, it just means with no government inside before Easter, they are now saying, naturally in Europe, no decision will be made until you have a German government. So the whole situation is extremely fragile in Europe right now. And, you know, many more countries are taking that as a reason to more and more ally with the Silk Road, Austria, Switzerland, the East Europeans, the Balkan countries, Italy, Spain, Portugal. They all strengthen their ties with the Belt and Road Initiative. And that is a very good thing. And it means the position of resistance held by Brussels and Berlin will not be tenable for very long.
From the United States, this last couple of days, there was the passage of the so-called tax reform bill. I know you have some thoughts on this. This is not going to solve any problems. What do you have to say about it, Helga?
Well, you know, obviously, this is celebrated as the first big victory of President Trump. I don't think it will solve anything. It will, you know, if you don't put it in the package of other measures, like, for example, Glass-Steagall, a credit system like Roosevelt's Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or like the National Bank of Alexander Hamilton, and, you know, basically ending the speculation in the derivative sector. If you only lower the taxes under these circumstances without curbing the other factors I just mentioned, what it probably will do is, you know, it will attract some investment in the United States for sure. But, you know, people in Germany already say, well, we have to protect ourselves, take countermeasures against it. So it will lead to an increased tension internationally. And probably in the United States, the present big corporations and banks will just use these tax cuts to invest more in the stock market, in buying up their own shares, what they have been doing since the crisis of 2008 with quantitative easing and the zero interest rate policy. And I think one reason why this is to be feared is Jamie Dimon, for example, laughed and said, oh, this is wonderful, this is quantitative easing for. So, you know, I think it just requires a continuation of our mobilization. I know our colleagues in the United States from LPAC, they have produced a new pamphlet, implement with the demand to implement the 4 laws of my husband, of Lyndon LaRouche, and why the United States must join with China in building the Silk Road, both domestically and internationally. So this pamphlet is out. I would encourage you, our viewers and listeners, to get a hold of this document, read it, because it has all the solutions. What are the correct economic conceptions? for the United States and the rest of the world to get out of this present crisis. This is all extremely urgent because, we could have a meltdown of the system any minute. And, just to mention it briefly, this Bitcoin mania, which is going on, is really a reminder of the tulip bubble before it burst. So China has recognized that danger. They are basically banning speculation in Bitcoins. And, all of these crazinesses make just clear the urgent need to implement Glass-Steagall and the entire 4 laws of Mr. LaRouche, which especially also includes a massive increase in the productivity of the workforce through a crash program in fusion technology, in space cooperation, in high-tech investments in general. And unless that is done, including high technology infrastructure, and the recent accident, the Amtrak accident in Washington State, just underlines, that this absolutely is necessary. Unless this is all done as a package, I don't think the world will get out of this crisis.
And Helga, I'd like to conclude with a question that, again, has come up from several viewers. People who fall prey to this idea that somehow China is a threat. And one of the things that people have picked up on is this concept, socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, you've written extensively on this, and it's not fair to ask you to summarize it in a couple of minutes, but that's what I'm going to do. What do we mean? What does Xi Jinping mean by socialism with Chinese characteristics?
Well, I think you also find right now an absolute growing and grown self-confidence of the Chinese, who point to the fact that nobody can debate the incredible success of the Chinese model of economy. And they point to the fact that their model is just very, very much superior and more successful than the Western model, which they refuse to follow. Now, there is such a thing as the, as facts, the formative value of facts. And, people should ask themselves, why is the Chinese model more successful? Well, the answer is very simple, that it is primarily devoted to the common good. And naturally, this is always criticized by the West, that, China is suppressing freedom and human rights and so forth. But in reality, if you ask yourself, is this complete mega individualistic hedonism of the West, is that really a value which is so desirable? Values which have reached a point where everything goes, everything is allowed. There is no more criteria for truth or for the acceptance of common good. Everything is, the survival of the fittest, and those who are rich become more rich, and those who have the misfortune to be poor become more poor. Is that really so desirable? Like in China, I'm convinced that while there is a debate about Marx, there is a debate about socialism with Chinese characteristics, I'm absolutely convinced, and I have looked at it for a long time and from many aspects, that what is meant with Chinese characteristics refers to the 2,500 years of Confucian tradition in China. The Confucian values, which I have written an article about last year, or this year actually, at the beginning of the year, pointing to the affinity of the ideas of Friedrich Schiller, the German poet, and Confucius, who both have an image of man, that man has a moral obligation to self-perfect his entire life or her entire life in order to serve better and more efficient to the common good. Now, obviously, sometimes that means that individual rights are, cut a little bit for the common good. I mean, one very good example was the building of the Three Gorges Dam, where people in the West were completely hysterical and said, oh, these poor 1,000 peasants who have to be moved so that this dam could be built. This is a trampling on freedom and human rights. Well, but if you take the view that with this dam, you had an enormous gain of hydropower, and thousands of people would not drown every time this river was flooded, maybe it is better to act in the common good. And, you know, sometimes you have to have, plus these peasants got other apartments which were much more modern and much better. So this is a typical example that if you put the common good ahead, and that is what China very clearly has done. I mean, they have lifted more than 700 million people out of poverty, and they have a very clear plan to move the remaining 42 million people out of poverty until 2020. And they're doing very efficient things to do that. We may have mentioned that already once, but I say it again. You know, they spot where are the poor people, which regions are they living in, and then they say what are the reasons, what has to be done to address it, to get them out of it. They use e-commerce for the farmers in far distant rural areas to market their products. So they are moving very, very efficient to uplift the entire population out of poverty. Now, how many poor people are in the United States? How many homeless? I mean, we heard figures in the last period that an unbelievable figure of 40% of all school children in New York come from homeless backgrounds. That doesn't mean they live on the streets, but they don't have an own home. So in Europe, you have 90 million people being poor, and nobody talks about lifting them out of poverty. The rate of poor people in Greece just increased, whereby I think 2/3 of the whole population is below the poverty line and has an income of below 1,000 euro. And a very high percentage of that, again, has only a part-time job, earning something like 450 euro per month. And there is no plan to change that. To the contrary, the EU is implementing more vicious austerity all the time. So, you know, I think that people should not look at this China question with prejudices. The Chinese model is completely different. It's based on 2,500 years of tradition. And, you know, there is something to this Chinese way of approaching things through peaceful approaches, through a win-win offer, which is really a better model of governance. And people shouldn't be so prejudiced. I think I have found that most people know nothing about China. You have a few handful of people who have been there, who do business there, and they are completely excited about the options which the new Silk Road is offering to the world. They're really transformed and totally excited. Because of the negative media, you have many people who still believe in the Chinese threat, who believe in the yellow danger and other propaganda campaigns of decades. And I think it's a shame, because if you look at China without prejudices, it is an incredibly interesting culture. It's rich. It's 5,000 years old. It has produced beautiful things in music, in poetry, in philosophy. It's one of the avant-garde countries in science already. It's an innovative country. So I would suggest that people, rather than even don't believe me, but start to investigate it and look for it yourself. And you will find that the thing is completely different than the Western media are, or some of the geopolitical think tanks are trying to tell you. And you will discover beautiful things, I promise.
Well, on that uplifting note, Helga, I think on behalf of the Schiller Institute, I'd like to wish people a Merry Christmas. But with your suggestion, don't just eat cookies and drink rum punch. Use it as an opportunity to reflect on the great opportunities for mankind today and what it means to have the Christmas spirit. And in that sense, the Christmas spirit and the Silk Road spirit should be one and the same. So Helga, we'll see you next week. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, Merry Christmas.